I remember the cold first, sharp enough to cut through wool, leather, even bone. The forest was still smoking from the bulge, burned-out Shermans and Panthers jutting from the snow like blackened ribs. Our column crept along a road that wasn't a road anymore, just a scar. Broken trees. Frozen mud. The stink of burned fuel buried under the smell of winter. I was inside a captured farmhouse, its roof half collapsed when the moment happened. We'd spread reconnaissance photos across a rough wooden table, grainy shots of wrecked positions, tiger silhouettes, armor plates cratered with failed hits. The stove crackled behind us, sounding much gentler than the pictures deserved. Outside you'd swear the war had paused. Mechanics banging track links back into shape. Tankers joking through cigarettes they couldn't quite keep lit in the wind. Someone hauling ammo crates. Someone else cleaning the bore of a gun that hadn't cooled since yesterday. Logbooks getting new entries while snow quietly buried yesterday's craters. And then I saw it. A silhouette in one of the photos. Larger. Meaner. Wrong. I froze. My breath stilled in my throat. I pushed the folder away like it might bite. The room went dead quiet. The kind of silence that always comes before somebody finally admits the truth everyone else is trying to outrun. And I heard myself say it before I realized the words were leaving my mouth. If we keep fighting with these tanks, it's going to be worse than anyone thinks. Now listen, if you think you already know how this story ends, you've only heard the comfortable version. Stay with me. Because the revelation that followed didn't just change our plans, it shattered the entire equation of armored warfare. And if you're here for the real story, the one buried under decades of myths and half-truths, make sure you're subscribed right now. I promise you, the moment coming next rewrote everything we believed about tanks, survival, and the future of the war. Tunisia, 1943. That's where the truth first caught up with us. I remember stepping onto that blistered sand thinking the Sherman was our hammer, and the Germans were just another nail. Reliable. Simple. Easy to fix. Our tanks were built by the thousands and someone told us that was enough. Numbers, speed, air support. Victory by weight, not finesse. And then the Tigers arrived. I saw one through binoculars the first time, massive, arrogant, a steel cathedral rolling straight toward us. Our 75mm shells hit its front and just sparked off, useless as raindrops. The thing kept coming, unbothered. Its gun roared once and a Sherman vanished in a blossom of dust and fire. That's when I understood we weren't equals on the battlefield. We were prey. From Africa to the jagged hills of Italy, then into France, we kept learning the same lesson. The Sherman could fight but not head-on. Never head-on. Our manuals didn't say it, but every crewman knew the rule: flank or die. Outnumber, outmaneuver, bleed the enemy with movement and improvisation. Meanwhile the Germans trusted their thick armor, long guns, and that cold confidence that their machines were the best on earth. By early 45 the pattern felt carved in stone. They were stronger per vehicle. We were stronger by logistics. A grim equilibrium. A balance held together by statistics and hope. But in the quiet halls of the Ordnance Department, thousands of miles from the front, far from the shellfire that shaped our thinking, someone was studying the wreckage reports with fresh eyes. Somebody who wasn't willing to accept good enough anymore. They saw the math, the armor angles, the velocity tables. And they came to a conclusion that felt like blasphemy at the time. The 75 was obsolete. The 76 was struggling. Even the new 90 wouldn't be enough for what was coming. For the first time, someone dared to suggest breaking the rules entirely. If German armor kept climbing higher, thicker, meaner, then America needed a gun that didn't just match that threat. It had to erase it. Not a tank. Not an upgrade. A monster. I remember reading the memo that first mentioned it. Consider adapting a 155mm artillery piece for armored use. I laughed when I saw it. Then I stopped laughing. Because the deeper you read, the more terrifying the logic became. This wasn't about leveling the field anymore. This was about rewriting it. I remember the room, stale coffee, blueprints stacked like fallen dominoes, officers rubbing their eyes raw from too many late nights. I'd been called stateside to observe developments, which usually meant someone wanted a tanker's opinion on a weapon they hoped would work. I expected another incremental fix. A better shell. A refined turret. Maybe a new suspension that wouldn't groan under mud. Instead they showed me madness. An engineer slid a sheet across the table, clean lines, impossible angles, a gun breech so large it looked like a furnace. I traced the outline with my finger and said the only thing that came to mind. You can't put that in a tank. He didn't smile. We're going to try. The proposal was simple and insane at the same time. Take a 155mm artillery piece, something meant to crack bunkers, forests, and mountains, and force it into a turreted vehicle. A tank gun so powerful that no German armor, present or future, could stand in front of it. The room erupted. Logistics officers warned about bridges collapsing under the weight. Maintenance chiefs complained about recoil that could shear bolts the size of my wrist. Someone pointed out that the shells were so heavy 2 men struggled just to lift one. And buried under all that was the question nobody wanted to say aloud. If we build this, will it even arrive in time for the war? But then came the numbers, cold, unforgiving. Penetration tables. Velocity projections. Armor curves showing even the Tiger II reduced to nothing more than a smoking memory at ranges where its crew felt untouchable. I watched the confidence drain from every face in that room. The 75 wasn't enough. The 76 wasn't enough. Even our proud 90 was already slipping behind the curve. The fracture didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened right there, in that quiet conference room where careers and doctrines cracked like ice under too much weight. I remember the general at the head of the table closing his folder slowly, like it suddenly felt heavier. "We've been playing by rules the enemy no longer respects," he said. "It's time to change the game." And in that moment, the truth hit me harder than any shell ever had. We weren't building a tank. We were building a warning, one aimed squarely at the future. When I walked out into the cold January air, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time since Tunisia, I believed we might create something the Germans weren't prepared for. Something that would make even a Panther hesitate. The old world was ending. And we were about to forge the blade that would finish it. The days that followed felt like watching a storm gather on the horizon. Slow at first, then suddenly violent. Once the idea of the 155mm gun escaped that conference room, it spread through the ordnance department like fire catching dry grass. Engineers who'd spent their careers refining practical, sensible designs were now sketching monsters. Heavy turret rings. Reinforced recoil cylinders. Hulls so thick they looked like ship armor. I visited the proving grounds and watched them wrestle with problems that seemed almost biblical. The recoil alone could shove a prototype backward like it had been punched by God. The turret weighed as much as an entire M5 light tank. The suspension groaned under the mass, springs flattening like dying snakes. Fix one issue and 2 more rows to replace it. And the shells, good lord, the shells. Each one was a small child's weight, and moving them required choreography. 2 loaders straining, another man guiding, sweat freezing on their jackets in the Maryland winter. Stacks of ammunition stood around the test stand like silent, sullen giants. Meanwhile, the war itself was accelerating. Every morning we checked the map on the wall, and every morning the front line had shifted again. The Red Army was closing on Berlin with terrifying speed. Our boys were pushing across France and into Germany. Tanks were burning by the dozens before lunch. Time wasn't just running out, it was fleeing. That was the paradox that gnawed at all of us. We were building a weapon for an enemy that might not exist by the time the bolts were tightened. But try telling that to the men in the workshops, sleeves rolled, welding arcs painting the ceiling white. They worked as if the fate of the continent still depended on a handful of steel and math. One night I stayed late in the drafting hall. Plans covered every desk. Elevations. Stress diagrams. Recoil paths. Somewhere down the line, someone had pinned a photo of a burned-out Sherman in the Ardennes. Reason enough, someone had scrawled beneath it. The message hit me like a hammer. Even if the war ended tomorrow, we needed to finish this machine. Not for today's battles, but for the ones we hadn't met yet. The Germans had forced us into a new era of armored warfare. And we weren't about to let that lesson fade just because Berlin was starting to burn. They like to say war is numbers, tons of armor, barrels per mile, shells per day. But when I think of the T-30, I don't see blueprints first. I see faces. I see the engineer with ink on his fingers instead of grease, a quiet man from Ohio who used to design bridges. One evening he tapped the side of the 155's breech with his knuckle and said, almost apologetically, "I used to calculate how much weight people could walk across. Now I calculate how much steel we can punch through before someone walks no more." He tried to laugh. It didn't quite land. In the factories, the air tasted of metal dust and hot flux. Women in bandanas and tired men with cigarette burns in their cuffs welded turret sections the size of houses. You could feel the vibration through the floor every time a plate locked into place. I walked past one crew struggling to align a mantlet that weighed more than a truck, and an older welder looked up at me and asked, "You ever ridden in one of these things, son?" "Too many times," I said. He nodded. "Good. Then you tell us if we miss something. Someone's boy's going to sit behind that gun." At Aberdeen, I watched the first crew circle the T-30 like it was some sort of idol dragged out of an older, angrier religion. The veterans, men who'd watched 75s bounce off Tigers, ran their hands along the armor the way a farmer checks a plow. They didn't smile much, but their shoulders lowered just a little. "This the one that finally answers them?" a sergeant asked me, palm resting on the turret. His eyes were tired in a way that didn't come from lack of sleep. "If anything will," I told him, "it's this." The recruits were different. Fresh uniforms, fingers still stiff on the ladders. To them, the war in Europe was already a story moving toward its ending. They posed for photos in front of the T-30, grinning, as if it were a carnival ride instead of a machine built to tear open anything it saw. I realized then that this tank meant two opposite things at the same time. To us who'd lived through Tunisia, Casino, Normandy, the Bulge, it was overdue payment on a debt of blood. To them, it was a relic of a nightmare they'd only heard about. And you watching this right now, keep that in mind. Every line on a spec sheet is written on somebody's nerves, somebody's sleep, somebody's grave. Tanks don't appear from nowhere. They are hammered together out of fear, hope, and the quiet conviction that the next crew deserves a better chance than the last. I was there the first time the T-30 fired in anger, if you can call it anger when the target can't shoot back. The test range stretched out before us like a frozen battlefield held in permanent pause. A captured Panther sat hulled out on a concrete pad, its paint peeling, its armor pitted from earlier trials. Beside it loomed a Tiger, the old terror, the one that had haunted our columns from Tunisia to the Ardennes. We stood behind the blast shield, a half-circle of officers, engineers, and tankers who had seen too many friends buried under thin armor and bad odds. The T-30 idled on its treads, engine rumbling with a depth I'd never heard from anything that wasn't naval. The smell of hot metal and cold wind twisted together, and for a moment I swear I felt the forest around St. Vith again. The snow, the silence, the awful certainty that we were outmatched. Then the loader slammed the first 155 into place. I don't know if you've ever seen a shell that large. It isn't ammunition, it's a verdict. Two men guided it into the breach, shoulders trembling under the weight. The breach locked with a clanging finality that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Gun ready," someone called. I swallowed hard. Whatever happened next would settle every doubt we'd carried since the first Tiger appeared in North Africa. Fire. The T-30 didn't just speak, it roared. The ground convulsed. Dust leapt from our boots. I felt the blast in my teeth. The shell crossed the range before my brain could process the recoil. The Panther didn't shudder, it split. The round hit high on the glacis, carving through steel that once mocked our 75s. A bloom of flame and shattered armor erupted from the far side as if the shell had punched a doorway straight through the tank. A cheer went up, raw and disbelieving. Even the engineers, usually calm as accountants, were shouting like boys at a prize fight. We fired again, this time at the Tiger. The old king didn't fare any better. The 155 tore into it with such violence that part of the turret lifted before crashing back down crookedly, like a broken crown. The myth of invulnerability, the thing that had haunted our nights, died right there in a plume of smoke. But as the cheers faded, a different silence settled. Word had come in that Germany was collapsing, faster than we'd expected. Berlin was cracking. The Bulge had failed. Every day the enemy we'd built this monster to kill was disappearing. I looked at the T-30, this giant we'd forged in desperation, and felt a pinch of bitterness I couldn't quite name. We had built a weapon that rewrote the battlefield. And the battlefield was ending without it. The war was slipping away faster than steel could be welded, faster than recoil systems could be refined, faster than even a monster like this could catch. We had created the answer. But the question was already dying. When the war finally cracked apart, when radios stopped screaming, when the maps stopped shifting, when German armor lay silent in ditches and ravines, I found myself standing beside the T-30 again, but this time the air felt hollow. The giant sat on its transport cradle like a museum piece waiting for a curator, not a weapon waiting for a battlefield. For weeks we'd lived with the expectation that it would be rushed across the Atlantic and hurled into some final armored crucible. Instead, the trucks rolled past it, carrying men home. We sent one prototype to Aberdeen, another to testing grounds where its gun thundered only for data, not for survival. I remember placing my palm against its glacis, the steel cold enough to sting. For the first time since Tunisia, I felt something like closure, not triumph, not victory, just quiet. The kind that settles when a storm finally decides to leave you alone. But in that quiet, the truth became clear. The Germans had never been gods. Their armor had never been invincible. For years we'd believed their tanks were something mythic, machines built from steel and arrogance, immune to our best efforts. Yet here stood our answer, too late to duel the enemy it was born to kill, but early enough to prove we had been capable all along. The post-war analysts tore into the T-30's performance reports with a hunger I hadn't seen during the war itself. They mapped its penetration data, charted its recoil forces, compared its shot patterns to the wrecks we dragged home from Europe. Every number led to the same conclusion. Not only could we match German engineering, we could surpass it. Dramatically. Decisively. That realization rippled outward. By 46, our doctrine shifted. No more good enough. No more relying on numbers alone. The Cold War was already coiling in the shadows, and the lesson of the T-30 shaped everything we built afterward. Bigger guns. Heavier armor. Faster development. Innovation not as a gamble but as a mandate. Yet the T-30 itself faded into obscurity, rolled into a hangar, photographed, studied, and then left to gather dust. A titan without a war. A masterpiece without a stage. But every time I walked past its silhouette, some part of me whispered the same thought. This was the moment the myth died. The moment German armored superiority stopped being a ghost in our heads and became just another chapter in a book we'd finally finished writing. The T-30 never fired a shot in combat. But it changed us. It proved the battlefield wasn't ruled by legends. It was ruled by whoever dared to rebuild the rules. And if you're still watching this, if you've stayed with me from those frozen forests of 45 to this quiet warehouse years later, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. What do you think happens when a perfect weapon arrives a moment too late?